So without further ado, here's our speakers. The rationale for having such a wide range of speakers was to reflect different views of the EU. We've got a business leader, 2 academics, and an MEP, a politician. So we really wanted to reflect all the views of those people. So, first we've got Richard Corbett. Richard Corbett is a member of the European Parliament for Labour, representing Yorkshire and the Humber. He's a deputy leader of Labour members in the European Parliament, vice chair of the European Movement in the UK. He was a co-reporter for the Parliament on the treaty establishing a constitution for Europe. His report formed the basis of the Parliament's official position on the treaty, and is a frequent commentator on European affairs. I think he was voted by a panel of retired diplomats, journalists, academics and think tankers as the 4th most influential Briton on EU policy. So please welcome Richard Corbett.
Thank you very much for that warm welcome. I only have 5 minutes, so I'll go straight to the point. Why do we want and need a European Union? I always say there are 3 reasons: idealistic, pragmatic, and selfish. Idealistic goes back to the origins of the movement that created the European Union, which go back to the years after the Second World War. This was a continent that had torn itself apart almost every generation from the fall of the Roman Empire until 1945. We simply had to find a better way of doing things. And the idea was to create a structure that brings the countries of Europe together, develops their common interests, and creates a place where we can settle our differences over a negotiating table or a debating chamber. Because we still have rows, of course, but we settle them in a somewhat better way than we used to for so long. That's why the Nobel Peace Prize was awarded to the European Union. And we tend to forget this. We tend to take it for granted, this area of stability that we've created in Europe. You don't need to look very far beyond the borders of the European Union to see how precious that is. The second reason is pragmatic. We are a group of neighbouring countries that are highly interdependent, economically, environmentally, in all kinds of ways. This is the structure we have developed to manage that interdependence, to work together, to try and find common solutions to common problems. Don't always succeed, it's difficult, but this is the structure that enables us to do that. In doing so, we've created a common market, the world's largest single market. Crucially, though, a market with rules to make it fair. Rules to protect consumers, rules to protect workers, rules to protect the environment. A lot of our discussions about whether we should toughen those up, as I would like, a little bit more, or leave it a little bit more to market forces. That's a traditional left-right debate you have in any country. But that is a bond, this single market, that binds us together in a constructive way and a way which is useful for our prosperity. Which brings me on to the third reason, the selfish reason. Britain is a trading nation. The European Union, the rest of the European Union, is by far our biggest export market. We sell more to the Netherlands than to the whole of the Commonwealth. I think more to Ireland than to China. It's vital for jobs in our country. Depending on whose estimates you believe, 3 to 4 million jobs depend on that trade. So it's vital not just that we have access to that market, that we are part of it indeed, but that we have a seat at the table where the common rules of the common market are negotiated. Because it's the easiest thing in the world to rig rules in a market to squeeze out your competitors. So, whichever way you look at it, idealistic, pragmatic, or selfish, you reach the same conclusion. We need a European Union. We need it to work better. Yes, nothing is perfect. The UK isn't perfect. I want to change it. I want to improve it and reform it. The European Union isn't perfect. But it's a darn sight better than the alternative, which is no European Union. Thank you very much.
Our second speaker is Richard Sharp. And Richard Sharp is a business leader. He's got a lot of working experience. He was a VP at Nokia for 11 years, vice president at Nokia for 11 years. Then he went on to be a managing director for 4 years at Assel Blois. And Group Product Director for 3 years at Tunstall Healthcare, and currently Richard is the Managing Director of a consultancy firm named Sharp Space, which I think is your own firm, I believe. Yeah. He's also a lecturer here at Leeds University, lecturing about management, and notably I know Richard through cross-cultural management. So Richard will give us a lot of insights into what it means commercially and economically for firms to stay in or to be out of the EU. Please give a warm welcome to Richard Sharp.
Thank you, Owen. So the views I will express in the next 5 minutes are designed to be provocative and stimulate debate. In or out of the EU? For some people, the issue is about macroeconomics. For others, the issue is as much about independence and self-determination. Can the UK better control its destiny inside the European Union or outside it? My central concern about the EU was well made for me by the Conservative government's pro-EU Business Secretary, Sajid Javid, who said of the EU last month, "It is a failing project, an overblown bureaucracy in need of wide-ranging and urgent reform." The question for me is, do I invest my vote in the failing project in the hope that the EU will reform itself, or do I invest my vote on Brexit and allow a failing British Parliament to resume control of this country? The Chief Executive of the British Chambers of Commerce called the EU referendum a choice between the devil and the deep blue sea. That statement cost him his job. Sajid Javid is still in post, perhaps because he supports the Prime Minister's view. So we were given a series of questions, and I'll try and answer them from a business perspective. For citizens, so what does Brexit mean for citizens and for business? For citizens, Brexit would mean change in a period of uncertainty, as new relationships were established. Some people believe that a vote to leave the EU would actually lead to the EU making a revised and better proposal for Britain, better than the deal that David Cameron has secured following his much publicised late-night meetings across Europe. Over time, Brexit will mean that laws reflect sovereignty of the British Parliament rather than the European Parliament. At the moment, EU laws are responsible for more than half of the UK's laws. British MEPs voted against 576 EU proposals over the last 5 years, but 485 still passed and became law. That is because the UK influence inside the EU is falling. Currently, the UK have 9.5% of the votes in the European Parliament. When we first joined, we had almost 20%. So for British people, Brexit will mean, in theory, they have more influence over their own society. For business, Brexit would mean different things depending on the type of business. In simple terms, I will categorise businesses into 3 types. Firstly, a global business. Global businesses will most likely want to stay in the EU. Big businesses do not like risk, and Brexit represents a risk, and it means they will have to invest resources in managing that risk and in influencing whatever the new arrangements are to be put in place. Big businesses tolerate the EU because they are better equipped to deal with the vast quantity of red tape. There are estimated to be 25,000 lobbyists in Brussels. They are there to protect vested interests and erect barriers to new competitors. I have experience of vested interests of the market-leading businesses operating in the EU. Some pay for so-called independent consultants to manage the standardisation processes. All large corporations flood standardisation bodies to embed their own patents into standards. EU funding projects like Horizon 2020 provide a good source of funding for those companies who are large enough to employ EU funding consultants. Secondly, SMEs in the UK that export to Europe. That's about 20% of SMEs who export to Europe. Brexit for them means the same as global businesses, but they may not have the resources to deal with the changes quite so effectively. Thirdly, the other 80% of SME businesses will see very little change in the short term. Over time, those who rely on cheap labour might see their costs go up as restrictions in the free movement of people are introduced. Over time, regulations may well change, and some would argue reduce. So should Britain remain in the EU? Reasons to remain in the EU. If you're a teacher, a nurse, a factory floor employee, a retail worker, i.e. someone that many politicians like to refer to as being on the front line, then your working conditions will be better protected in the EU. If you want political, social and economic integration, then vote to remain. If you are happy to hand over the management of Britain to Brussels, then vote to remain. To use a business metaphor, Britain is slowly but surely being acquired by the EU. Britain is a subsidiary, a business unit of a larger global corporation. Reasons to leave the EU. Britain is the 5th largest economy in the world, with an excellent network and very experienced diplomats capable of managing the UK on the world stage. We are a major contributor to NATO, and we have a permanent seat at the UN Security Council, in addition to our fundamental roles in the OECD, the G8 and the Commonwealth. Leaving the EU would give Britain its own seat at the World Trade Organization, rather than being represented by the EU. The main reason in my mind to consider leaving is because the EU is between a rock and a hard place. It must either go back to being the common market we voted for in 1973 or become a fully federalised state. It cannot remain in this limbo. We were asked why Cameron was trying to reform the EU and what does it mean. I would say that Cameron's primary aim is not to be the Tory who takes the UK out of the EU. He was forced into this referendum by his backbenchers and by UKIP. He talks of reform, but he went to the EU with a limited set of objectives and failed to achieve those. On a purely personal view, I get extremely annoyed when politicians work through dinner and debate through the night in some sort of show of masculinity to reach a deal. For me, it is another example of poor management that they have to make decisions about my future at 4 o'clock in the morning. As a postscript, the In campaign is making very little reference to the New Deal that Cameron negotiated. Instead, they are using the tactics of Project Fear. So, what has been the impact of the EU membership on citizens and businesses in the UK? Access to EU markets, access to EU regulations. In some ways, EU membership has made UK citizens more outward-looking, but at the same time, the UK has been held back and failed to appreciate the global opportunities as it has been preoccupied by Europe.
Sorry, Richard, that's
Okay, thank you.
Our third speaker is Jeremy Clegg. Jeremy Clegg is a professor at the Leeds University Business School. He's a Jean Monnet professor, which means he knows a lot about the EU, essentially, without going into too much details. He's a professor in European integration and international business management. He's got a widely respected voice in policy circles. He's published influential work on the determinants of foreign direct investment into Europe and how regional economic integration, which is what Europe is, a form of regional economic integration, fosters foreign direct investment. More particularly, he's known for his work on the relationship between market liberalisation and foreign direct investment. He's currently involved in research and policy advice on the planned EU-China bilateral investment treaty. So that means he will tell us a lot about what it means not only for firms within the EU, but for firms outside the EU, to have the EU as a common market, or to have the UK as part of the EU. So please welcome Jeremy Clegg.
Thank you very much indeed, Owen. The internal market of the EU is the UK's domestic market. In the world in which we live, it is very important to have a large domestic market. The European Union is currently negotiating bilateral agreements with major sovereign states in the rest of the world and other economic organisations in order to free up the movement, the international movement of goods and services, and also investment. And if you could put the pie is up, that's good. As we've heard, the UK economy is big, but the EU economy is much bigger. it's actually 6 times bigger. The UK is the yellow slice there, and you can see that we would not be able, we would not be able to extract the same negotiating benefits from discussions with China, with North America, with other parts of the world, if we were negotiating just as a single state of that size. At present, we're about to, in the run-up stage to negotiating with China, the European Union, an international investment agreement, a bilateral investment treaty. And following that may well be a free trade agreement as well. Why is this particularly important? It's particularly important because we need growth, and these sort of negotiations are the way in which the European economy and the UK, as a big part of it, can participate in that growth. You can see that we will be more likely to get benefits in negotiating down the barriers that there are in markets like China. China's obligations under the WTO actually remain quite protected. China has quite a protected domestic industrial sector, especially the services. Only the European Union would be able to make a big impression on liberalisation in China. The UK on its own would not have that bargaining power. As a British firm, how would you feel if your EU counterparts enjoyed preferential market access over you, either in trade or investment? You would be furious. And what you want is to have a level playing field. What you might do as a British firm outside of the EU is relocate to a continental European location and do business from there. You may well be better off, because you'd have to, once out of the EU, the UK would have to negotiate all of those treaties all over again, and that's a very big undertaking indeed. So, these differences in preferences may seem small, but they are palpable, because the degree of favourability of terms under these international treaties varies by country, by treaty, quite significantly so. And that can make all the difference between competitive advantage and lack of competitive advantage. The EU is in the best position possible to be able to get that competitive advantage. And this scale translates into other dimensions. Think of, for example, the major multinational corporations, which these days seem to be more important and more powerful than nation states. The EU can do something about this. The UK on its own, especially with respect to fiscal deals, tax sweetheart deals, is in a less strong position to do this, I think, as we have seen. So therefore, the EU can confer to us huge advantages of being part of something much bigger, into which we have a very strong voice. And I think that bargaining power for me is just as important across the field. The digital economy, all of these dimensions are significantly important in the future. So, we don't have fiscal harmonisation. And we've seen the problems with that. I'm not saying that we in the UK should have gone the whole hog to be part of the euro area. I think there are very few people in the UK or anywhere who'd say that the UK should have joined the EU. But however, the fiscal discipline that we haven't had under the euro area is a weakness. So that is something which should have been strengthened. And we've had to have fiscal integration through the back door, sadly, because we didn't see it coming.
Jeremy, what is a fiscal union?
Fiscal union is where you have we know we have monetary union, fiscal union, where you have a common fiscal authority for the entirety of the European Union. So not the UK setting corporate tax rates, personal tax rates on their own, but some harmonised, at least harmonised, tax rates across, which would mean the advantages of relocating businesses and doing deals, this infrastructure for doing deals, would be undermined, and there would not be the incentives in the member states in order to try to undermine the integrity of the internal market and the European Union. So the institutions of the EU can protect us much more than we perhaps realise. And for the future, I think it's true to say that the concept of the EU is overwhelmingly positive. The concept is overwhelmingly positive, but we cannot pretend there are not problems with the implementation. But we can work towards that implementation within the European Union, redouble our efforts, and I think there's a lot of sympathy and understanding across the EU that that is what we need to do together, not just for our own internal benefit, but with respect to our place in the world and taking a big share of world economic growth.
And finally, last but not least, Marco Verones Passarella, Professor of Economics at Leeds University. He's a very influential academic. His areas of expertise are theories of value and distribution, macroeconomic dynamics, monetary economics, and history of economic thought. He teaches current topic in European integration, so he'll tell us all about current issues faced by the EU. And was involved in the FESSUD project, which is a European multidisciplinary project in understanding how finance can better economic, social, and environmental goals. Is that correct? Yeah. So please give a warm welcome to Marco Passarella.
Thank you for the invitation. Indeed, I'm very glad and I feel honored to be here. As you probably know, I'm Italian. Even though so I don't have to vote for the referendum. I feel lucky enough because I'm very undecided, to be honest with you. Even though I'm applying for the British citizenship in 2017, I can do that. I will do that for my daughter, who was crying a few minutes ago outside that she's going to be a proper Yorkshire girl.
Is that why she was crying?
And also for myself, because I think that when you spend years in a certain country, that country becomes your home. However, being Italian matters today, for us, for today's discussion. And the reason is, if you ask me about Italy, if you ask me whether Italy should leave the euro area, so the European Monetary Union, and hence the European Union, because you can't leave the euro area without leaving the European Union, I have no doubt Italy should have never got in the euro area. And as for the exit right here, right now, my only doubt concerns the political class and the vested interests that would end up leading the exit process. So to sum up, economically speaking, I have no doubt Italy should be leaving. Politically speaking, I'm very skeptical.
Leaving the euro, then, not the union.
We are talking about the euro area and the European Union, because in principle, I think you can't decide to leave the euro area without leaving the European Union. You are compelled to leave also the European Union. Obviously, there is harsh discussion about this.
Britain's in...
No, Britain is not in the euro area. I mentioned the case of Italy because turning to the UK, my feeling is somewhat the opposite. I don't see any real economic net benefit coming from the exit strategy. I'm not telling you that it would be a catastrophe. I'm telling you that I don't see any real benefit, net benefit. And by contrast, I recognize that there are some strong political arguments. Let's focus on the economic side first. What happens if the UK leave yes, the European Union? Well, firstly, the UK government should renegotiate the trade deals and agreements with the other countries, with the EU and also with the other countries, because when you are a member of the EU, you have a common external policy and system of tariffs and so on. Now, the most, I would say, likely scenario is that the new agreements, the new deals, will be very similar, probably slightly worse than the old ones. On the other hand, the British government has not adopted the euro. In principle, is not compelled to meet the Maastricht criteria, the fiscal compact, the Stability and Growth Pact, and all of the fiscal conditions. In addition, David Cameron got the commitment that the UK won't be part of a closer European Union. You don't have to pay benefits to foreign workers for years. The City of London will never be under the direct control of the European authorities, and so on and so forth. This means that if you are risk adverse, you better stay. There's no real economic benefit from the, say, leave strategy. Again, don't get me wrong. I'm not telling you that if you leave, that's a catastrophe for this country. We have other countries in Europe, think of Norway, who are not members of the EU, and I mean, people there are living, surviving rather well. What I'm telling you is that it's probably not worth doing, in my opinion. You can have also some speculative movements on the financial markets right before and right after the possible exit or the referendum. So this means that it does not make sense to leave the EU unless you take into consideration or you refer to the political side of this story, meaning both your idea of democracy and your overall idea of society. If you think that democracy matters, if you are not happy that your future is decided by a bunch of bankers and bureaucrats in Brussels and Frankfurt, if you think that you don't want your future to be decided by hidden agreements between the European Union and the US corporations, such as the so-called TTIP, if you think that the free mobility of capital is not a religious dogma, is not the gospel, that actually free mobility of capital means that workers are not free to move, workers are compelled to move. I didn't decide to come to the UK. I was compelled to come here because they are destroying my country. That's the problem. If you think that, for instance, the state should be renationalizing some sectors, the railways or other strategic sectors in this country, well, the hypothesis to leave the European Union makes sense. In other words, paradoxically enough, it's Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party should be very critical towards the European Union institutions. And I'm going to explain why later on. So thank you for now.
So very quickly now, I'm just going to ask the speakers to rate from a scale to 1 to 10. If 10 is the United States of Europe, and 1 is absolutely no relationship with the EU whatsoever, and 5 is the status quo, it's what we're in right now. What they would do, what will be their number? So we'll go from left to right, I think.
We just put it up.
Oh, just put it up.
But can we comment on
I think you can do probably later, but in the interest of time, I'd be quite keen just to put it up so that people get an idea.
Because if you ask me about the United States of Europe, it's 10. But if you ask me about the European Union, it's a different story.
In terms of degree of integration, we'll go with 10 being the United States of Europe and 5 being the status quo, and 1 being no relationship at all.
For the UK.
For the UK.
Yeah.
The UK. 1, 2, 3, go.
Is that 9?
So what do we have? We have 10, 6, 6, and 110.
1 or 10.
1.0.
Oh, 1.0.
We either go one way or the other, but at the moment we are between a rock and a hard place.
Yeah. And in the audience, so I can't go through all the numbers, but who's a 1 on that scale? Got one person. Who's a 10? We got a few. Who's between kind of 2 and 4? Okay. Who's 5? Everything's fine right now. Yeah. Who's between 6 and 8? Okay. So more integration. Okay. So you like to go in. Got a poor EU audience here. Let's go now to what does Brexit actually mean. So what does it mean to be out of the EU? What are Britain's options? What are we looking at here? And I think we'll start with Richard Corbett on this one, just because he is very involved into all that politically.
Well, in economic terms, I mean, the EU's about a lot more than just economics. We focused on economics, of course, up to now. But the campaign that wants to leave the European Union is actually quite divided on what alternative it would offer if we were out. Half of them say, well, we'd still try and be in the single European market. We'd try and negotiate full access to that market, assuming you could negotiate that without any problem, having just walked out slamming the door on all your neighbouring countries. But for the sake of argument, let's say we get that full access. Then indeed we would be in a comparable situation to Norway, which you mentioned earlier. Norway's problem is that to be part of the single market, it has to accept the common rules for the common market. So almost all EU legislation is transposed into Norwegian law by the Norwegian Parliament without them having a say in it.
So just to clarify, so, Norway's not part of the
yeah,
EU,
Norway's
but
not
it is
in
part of the single market.
Yeah, it's negotiated pretty full, not quite full. It's not managed to get its fish in, for instance, without a tariff barrier, which is crucial for Norway. But most Norwegian products have access to the single market. The result is Norway has to accept the rules, has no say on them, and has to pay into the European budget. Not very satisfactory. So the other half of the Leave campaign realise that's not a very attractive option. So they say, never mind Europe, we'll go global. Forget the European Union. 2 problems. First, you're forgetting your main export market, so you'd be facing tariffs to access that market. British cars, for instance, most of our cars manufactured here are sold in the rest of Europe. They would face a tariff. Not very good for jobs or for our economy. The second problem is that you would then have to, which you have to do anyway if you leave the EU, negotiate new trade agreements with countries across the whole world to replace the agreements that we currently have via the EU, because Europe negotiates at the moment collectively on trade agreements. As we heard earlier from Jeremy, that gives us more leverage in trade negotiations. But if you leave and you have to negotiate in a hurry, in 2 years, by the way, by yourself with countries across the world, just as Britain, are you going to get as good a deal? It's doubtful. One example. 4 years ago, the EU-Korea, South Korea trade agreement started to apply. Since then, British exports to South Korea have doubled because we got access to the Korean market. They gave us that access in return, of course, for access for their products to the European market. But given what they produce, the part of the European market they were most interested in was Germany. Now, if we come along separately as Britain and say, we'd like to have that same agreement, they'd say, what's in it for us? Just to keep the status quo would be difficult. To improve on it, to compensate for the lost trade with the rest of the European Union, very unlikely. So both those 2 alternative scenarios, in my view, are bad news. And that's just the economics.
What about academic on the theories of what are Britain's options, maybe? Jeremy?
Yes. Well, to respond a bit to what Richard just said, we've got a better strategy, Owen. Outside of the European Union, the UK would target the North Korean market. And they target us pretty quickly as well, in a different way, though. So I think what it would mean to be outside of the EU would be much more problematic than we, especially in a university, tend to think. We tend to think the short-term adjustment costs are, we have to go through a little bit of pain, but in the long term it's going to be better. Well, there isn't really that long term. The short term is where we live, and the short term isn't actually that short. All of those adjustment costs, the lack of competitiveness, which of course Richard has mentioned there, think of it the other way round. We wouldn't have those advantages in competitiveness, and that adds up. What does it add up to? Lack of GDP growth. What does lack of GDP growth mean? It means unemployment. It means falling behind. And I think outside of the European Union, we would suffer economic and quite shortly after that political difficulties, which would be consequent to that diminution of economic performance. I'm not a politician. We pay politicians to think about these things, but outside of the EU, the United Kingdom, I don't know that it would want to remain as united as it even currently is. I would understand for the constituent parts of the UK to seek to leave, and with a new reason that they could join the European Union, and they could. And so I think that outside we would have much more profound economic problems, political problems in the UK, which are never that far away. It's only growth and success which legitimises the current constitution of the United Kingdom, and we have to attend to that. What Cameron is trying to do, I think it was already said, I think that the Prime Minister has been having to react to political difficulties which are pressures upon him. And he's playing for high stakes. I just hope that the British public will be able to come to a very informed decision, and I believe if they are informed, that they will make a decision to stay in the European Union.
Anybody else on the question of what does it mean to be out? Richard?
I'm very, very undecided, because on one hand, I totally agree, leaving the EU is not a good business if you accept the status quo, at least. But we can't really tell you that the EU is going to change. There's no real room for reforms in the European Union. So if you accept it, fair enough, you better stay. But I wouldn't create the illusion that the European Union is going to change and to become something else. The European Union is in an area where capital, commodities, services, and sometimes workers are free to move, where there is some red tape as a result of the bargaining power of the member states, and that's it. This is the European Union today, and there's no way to change it. I mean, do you prefer sushi or sausages rolls? Can you raise your hands?
Used for sushi.
Quite a lot, more than sausages rolls. You are not true British. Right, okay. Let's assume that you get back home and you are starving and you realize that your flatmates have prepared sausages rolls. Right. You have three options. The first, you eat the sausage rolls and that's it. The second, you ask them to transform the sausage rolls into sushi. The third, you get rid of the sausages roll and you try to prepare yourself some sushi. Clearly, the second option is just a theoretical option. It's not realistic. You can either accept the European Union, and that's it. It's fair enough for me. I'm getting old, so I'm not a revolutionary anymore. When like you, I was a revolutionary, probably. Or you try to create something else. If you have a different idea of society, you have to leave. If you don't have a different idea of society, you accept the status quo and you do whatever you can do in the European Union, but be aware that nothing is going to change there.
So, Marco, Cameron's reform is a dead end, is it?
Just some minor reforms. But, I mean, the room is very... sometimes I have the possibility to speak with people who work for the Italian government, these pink doctors, and we have these discussions, and I understand them. There's nothing to do if you are in the Italian government. You can't really control the fiscal policy, the monetary policy. You can't decide anything. So yeah, I
That's
accept.
absolute nonsense.
If you are an Italian politician, there's nothing you can do because you have a number of constraints, fiscal and monetary constraints. So you can do nothing.
Let's get a rebuttal to that information.
Well, I would disagree entirely with that. I mean, when you say that particular constraint on the Italian government, I presume you mean the fiscal limits on the deficits. Now, it's true, in the Eurozone, there's an agreement by the Eurozone countries that they shouldn't run public sector deficits of more than a certain size, which probably makes good sense in the long run anyway, unless there's a big economic downturn and you have a deliberate fiscal stimulus, okay? But within that, it's entirely up to you as a country to decide which, if you've got an excessive deficit, whether you want to cut expenditure or raise taxes. If you're raising taxes, which ones you want to raise. If you want to cut expenditure, which expenditures you want to cut, or if you want to sell assets or whatever. And that's on the narrow front of economic policy, and on everything else you're free as well. So I disagree with that. And I certainly disagree with the idea that the EU is fixed as it is now forevermore and is unreformable. The EU is a non-stop negotiation of 28 countries. It's forever changing its existing policies. It's forever changing its existing structure. We've had 6 treaty changes in the last quarter century, revisions of the very fundamental rule book of the European Union, let alone day-to-day policy making, which is always changing. Common fishing policy, which needed reform, was completely overhauled 2 years ago. The agricultural policy has been reformed. The deepening of the single market on services and so on. All this is change. It's true the EU changes slowly. It's not easy when you've got 28 countries. It doesn't happen overnight. But if you stand back and you look at, say, a decade-long period, it's amazing how much it moves on and changes.
I agree, but you don't change the nature of the European Union. You change some rules according to...
What do you mean by nature?
The European Union is not the union of European people. The European Union is the union of European capitals. And it's a free trade area with some additional red tape to regulate other stuff. That's the European Union.
I think we'll pause that for a second because we've got a question on the red tape coming later on. But just for Richard,
well,
what does it mean for businesses? What do you think it means for Brexit? What does Brexit mean?
yeah, I think for, as I stated in my opening comments, I think for businesses that don't deal with the EU, it won't make too much difference in the short term. For those that do, companies like Nissan have stated it would make no difference to them whether or not we're in or out. 36 of the FTSE 100 companies said that they supported us staying in the EU. Therefore, 64 of them didn't make any comment at all. So I think for big business, they'll handle it. I think the idea of tariffs, from what I've read, the tariffs will be on average 3%. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. I think that...
Well, nominal tariff, yeah.
Nominal tariffs. And I think we've all heard the comments in the media that Europe sells more to us than we do to them. So I think that the European businesses will be very pragmatic about doing business with the UK. It is, the UK is a large economy in its own right, so I think it will be able to negotiate. Clearly the EU has done a lot in the last 20 years, but as I said, it moves very slowly, so I would hope that the benefit of the UK being outside of the EU is that the politicians will be more accountable and will also be able to move more quickly than the glacial pace of the European Commission.
So for you, Richard, I mean, because you run a business, what would it mean for you if suddenly the UK said, no, we don't want to be part of the EU, and we don't have a harmonisation of regulations, we don't, I mean, it's services, so presumably it's not as the same thing as manufacturers.
Well, for me, it would mean nothing as a small business. The distinction will come. You know, the hardest hit might be the small business, I would say the small business who export into Europe. I think the large businesses that export into Europe will be perfectly well equipped to deal with that. Bear in mind, change is not going to come quickly. The door will not be slammed. You know, I've read that there is a presumed continuous of trade regulations which could last up to 10 years. So there is no sort of, you know, we don't fall off a cliff if we vote to go out. And some people have said, actually, if we vote to leave, then perhaps the EU will pragmatically come back with, you know, better terms than Cameron was able to discuss and negotiate last time.
I think, Richard, you would disagree with that.
I'd love to come in on several points, but I'm aware you have an agenda with several questions, and some of these points will come up in those questions.
Okay, cool. So we'll go first to our first motion, which is European laws are made by unelected bureaucrats. How is moved away from national citizens? We have to leave. Can you answer the question?
Yeah. Okay, shall I do that one?
So, I mean, Richard, you have to go first. You're in the Parliament, so we can't be addressing the issue of democracy without talking to the person in the Parliament.
Yeah, one of the things that disturbs me the most about the Leave campaign is that they have a whole set of cliches about the European Union which are fundamentally untrue. And one of those is that we have all these laws imposed on us by unelected bureaucrats in Brussels. So they even say the figure of 80% of our laws are made by these unelected bureaucrats in Brussels. Well, firstly, according to the House of Commons Library, which is politically neutral and well placed to assess these things, it's 13.2% of our laws that we make jointly at European level, mostly common rules for the common market and consumer protection and things. Second, this huge bureaucracy they talk about, the European Commission, is about the same size as Leeds City Council in the number of people working for it, and a good third of them are to do with translating and interpreting into different languages.
Just to clarify, what is the European Commission? What does it do?
The European Commission is the central administration of the European Union, with its different directorates general coming under a group of 28 commissioners. They are appointed by the Prime Minister of each country. Just like the Prime Minister appoints ministers in a national government, he or she appoints a member of the European Commission for their country. But the commissioners as a whole, to take office, have to be approved by the European Parliament after public hearings. But the crucial thing is this: the Commission does not decide. The Commission proposes European legislation. Its proposals only become law if they pass two democratic tests. First is they have to get a majority in the European Parliament, elect your directly elected members of the European Parliament, and unlike some national parliaments that I know, the European Parliament doesn't have an inbuilt pro-government majority, because the Commission isn't really a government and it can't whip people into line. You have to, it's not like the House of Commons where the government always gets its way whenever it proposes legislation, or almost always. You have to build your majority issue by issue. The second test is a body called the Council, which is composed of a minister from each and every country, elected governments, around the table in the Council. So there are two democratic tests. So you don't get any European legislation unless it's been approved by your elected MEPs, so that's democratic, and by elected governments in the Council of Ministers, by a hefty majority too. The minimum majority to adopt anything is a qualified majority. That represents 65% of the population in the European Union. So the onus is quite high to adopt anything at European level. Where there is a weakness in democratic control in our country is the control the national parliament exercises over the minister representing Britain in the Council. In the Nordic countries, any minister going to a council meeting goes beforehand to his or her national parliament and says, look, this is what's on the agenda, this is the position I'm intending to take, and they can shape his or her position, they can mandate him, as it were, rather than just hearing about it afterwards. Why don't we do that in Britain? You don't need to negotiate that with anybody else. That's a question of changing our own procedures. So where I think there is a deficit in our democratic procedures at European level, it's in our hands to improve it. But for heaven's sake, don't give me this line anymore that bureaucrats impose things on hapless member states who are blissfully unaware of what's happening. It's rubbish.
Yeah, can I come back to that? Because I think that member states may not be blissfully unaware, but I think the general population is totally unaware of what's going on in Europe, and I think there's the big problem. You know, we're talking today with very intelligent, educated people, and you are stopping and asking for definitions of what all these institutions are. Okay, and you guys are smart. Okay, you are the top 1%. So 99%, whatever, you know, a majority of people in the UK don't really know what's going on in Europe, because they're, you know, in terms of the way that we're structured,
and our media.
Some people just about keep up with the UK politics, you know, but nobody really has a clue about what's going on in Europe. It's so far removed, and I think that's one of the issues, that the organisation is so big, so far removed, that most individual citizens don't really know what's going on.
And that's not very democratic. Jeremy?
Well, I think I would add, because I only really want to add something, is that the laws are that people see as being originating with the European Union, of course, should have their basis in what the European integration, the treaties that have been signed, those obligations being worked upon by the European Commission, the Directorates General, which we can think of as ministries. They're not really ministries, but they're cut up in a way that is like a ministry-like sort of structure to cover all of the important areas of governing an economy. And what the European Commission officials are trying to do is to try to better fit the European economy to what the member states have signed up to. So all that sounds very good. And a question I would ask Richard, is although he has said that he doesn't believe that laws are made by unelected bureaucrats, I would like to ask him whether he thinks that some of the work that comes out of the European Commission might, on some occasions, be seen as being a little bit too enthusiastic, an interpretation of what those treaty intentions actually were, and maybe end up as being counterproductive. And it may not be the intention of the European Commission officials. It may be something structural in the sense that there hasn't been the consultation that takes place, and there's a lot of lobbying that goes on in Brussels, and that is a matter of concern. I mean, Marco has he's referenced quite some important concerns here, which is to do with the way in which institutions can be affected, and they may be those things that militate, here's an idea, against the small and medium-sized enterprises. They may benefit the larger firms. It's a possibility. It's a possibility. I just thought of it now. It's a possibility. The large firms may in fact be influencing those laws through the huge amount of work that they do to influence, and that may come out as being red tape that hits small and medium-sized firms because they are less able to bear, and so therefore that's a failure in the governance system. Over to Richard.
Well, yes, of course the European Commission might come up with flawed proposals. And that's why they don't have the right to decide by themselves. That's why there are these two tests, and if they come up with flawed proposals, it's up to me and my colleagues in the European Parliament to correct them, and up to ministers in the Council to correct them. It's the same at national level. Civil servants can come up with over-enthusiastic ideas, and that doesn't mean they're going to be taken through the whole way. And yes, there are lobbyists in Brussels. Fortunately, it's not just big business. There's plenty of NGOs, from Greenpeace to public health organisations to the BirdLife International and so on. You get a heck of a lot of ideas put to you in Brussels, but it's your job to remember that all these lobbyists represent a particular interest or viewpoint. You're accountable to the population as a whole, the electorate as a whole, and you've got to weigh up that, and that's part of the normal democratic process at any level of governance. Yes, you're right, Richard, the institutions are more distant from people. That's a good reason not to do things at European level if we can do them perfectly well at national or local level. That principle, in the EU jargon, it's called the principle of subsidiarity, is written into the treaty. We shouldn't act at European level when we can perfectly deal with something at national level. That's why the process has this safeguard of a very high majority of member states to do anything at European level. And even then it has to be only on a subject that's written into the treaty that everybody has agreed we should do at European level, and you can only change that if everybody agrees. So there's plenty of safeguards against over-centralisation. But if we are acting at European level, then let's make it as open, transparent and democratic as possible and hope that the media reports it a bit better.
Marco?
Just a few seconds.
Sorry, I'm a bit long, yeah.
Actually, if you think of the management of the Greek crisis, you immediately realize that what the European Union institutions have done there is just to defend the vested interests of French and German banks. If we can call them democracy, we can do it. We can use different names for different things. You can think also of the management of the immigration or refugees crisis. Once again, you have an example of the nature of the European Union. I'm not telling you that the European Union is not changing. Obviously, it's changing. Even the European Central Bank, when talking about the euro area, is changing. They are doing things that a few years ago were unthinkable. But the nature of those institutions is not changing. That's the problem. It's a problem of idea of society. I mean, I'm not telling you that you should leave. If I could vote for the referendum, I would be very undecided. But the European Union is not a democratic place where European people, can stay together. The European Union is maybe not a bunch of bureaucrats. It's a bunch of large corporations, also bureaucrats, bankers,
trade
financial
unions.
speculators. Trade unions, I wanted to tell you this point. You didn't invite any trade union delegate today, even though I'm not that disappointed, because if I have some slides about that. A few weeks ago, I came across this flyer or poster of, the last one, where they say, what has Europe, I think they mean European Union, ever done for us? Protection at work, holidays, time off work, and the number of rights. But actually, I thought it was 200 years of class struggle in this country, involving million people killed in the streets, in the factories, in the squares. I think that's a terrible, disgraceful example of bad propaganda.
Absolutely nonsense. The fact that those things are enshrined in European law, when you have a common market, that means you are avoiding a race to the bottom. Because you know what the capitalists tell you. They say, we can't do this in our country because we'd be less competitive with the rest of the single market. So we can't give you paid holiday, or we can't give you the workplace rights that you enjoy. We can't have maternity leave. We can't have paternity leave because the others aren't doing it, and we'd be less competitive. Yeah? So having that as a common rule, a common standard, below which you cannot go for the whole of the single market is fundamental for protecting those rights, which indeed were fought for over centuries, you're absolutely right there, but would be frittered away by especially when you have centre-right governments that want to undermine those rights. They would be the first ones to say, oh, well, we can't compete if we have to do this, let's look. And then the next country says, we'll go lower as well, and then the next country goes lower as well to try and compete by lowering standards. It's the same for workplace rights, it's the same for consumer protection rules, it's the same for environmental standards. So enshrining that in European law was fundamental.
Do you agree?
Yes, those laws apply in those countries as well.
You know that.
And the Greece the Greece deal you mentioned, by the way, I don't see the Greek government, Tsipras or the former finance minister Varoufakis saying we want to leave the European Union. They don't even want to leave the euro, let alone the European Union. So yes, Greece was not well treated by, it wasn't the EU budget, by the way, that bailed out Greece, it was the IMF and fellow Eurozone countries, not us. But those other Eurozone countries did give Greece the biggest ever loan in international history, on the one side, but imposed draconian conditions on the other side. That was a political battle which I would have liked to see end up differently. But the idea of not bailing out Greece would have been worse for everybody concerned.
Just one very quick point. I agree with Richard in this. In my experience of global organisations, they will locate manufacturing in places where labour costs are lowest.
So essentially, whilst it doesn't mean that the UK wouldn't adopt, or the UK would probably still adopt fairness at work and all that.
Would you trust this government to protect fairness at work? Would you?
I'm not from here. I'm going to move to the next motion. EU membership costs a fortune. This outweighs the benefits for businesses and consumers of staying in. By the way, the science is neutral. We just knew that everybody here was a bit pro-EU, so we were trying to be provocative here. So there's a picture of Nigel Farage saying Brexit made the non-EU wheat. And there's an article saying cost of EU membership clearly outweighs the benefits. It is a Daily Telegraph, so we'll take this with a pinch of salt. But yeah. So on this one, I think we'll start with a business person here.
Okay. So I really struggle with this because the analysis I did shows the Leave campaign says that it costs 11% of GDP in terms of regulation, poor governance and administration. According to the Stay campaign, it costs £350 per household per year and has a benefit of £3,000. So, you know, as in all things to do with, you know, numbers, there's a very famous phrase which says there are lies, damn lies and statistics. And you will be able to find someone who will be able to argue both sides of this debate very effectively.
Jeremy? Should we see it as a balance of this?
It cannot be, and you have to think of the time structure as well, because even if it theoretically balanced out over 100 years, is that the period of time that we have at our disposal with all of the other challenges of greenhouse gas emissions, the environment, a whole number of things that are actually far more important. But is it a balance? And actually, I think if we learn from history, if we look back at some of the things that happened in the past, I said, you know, the UK would have been desperate to get into the European Union had it not joined in 1973. It didn't join in when it was originally asked at the formation, and it was desperate to get in. And that's not just because of Prime Minister Heath, it's before that, of course, as well. So Britain has a very fine pedigree of this type of relationship with the European Union. So what it comes down to is that we do not these sorts of evaluations are fraught with difficulties. We had estimates of the pros and cons of having the single market, of reducing non-tariff barriers within the European Union internal economy. Looking back, all of the estimates, it could have been one way or the other way. The truth of the matter is we have to take a judgment, and the judgment is that if you need more competition, which we do, if you need more market access, which we do, which is just talked about the tariff rates, well, I've talked about the access to international markets around the world, and we can't predict where the growth is going to be in the world. There are all of these sources of growth, and it's not an accounting balance like these numbers. It isn't that. It's all of these things, and when you get them, because if you go through a terrible period of not growing, you may never get that ground back up again. And so that is, in my view, it's a question whether it doesn't cost a fortune, and I would say the benefits almost certainly will not be undermined by whatever costs there are. Not whatever, but the ones that we have at the moment. And we have to work harder to try to mitigate those costs, and I hope we get on to how to cut red tape. I think you've got that later on, haven't you? Yeah.
Marco, do we need competition? I'll just go Marco first and then finish my mission.
No, I told you that I don't like the Unite flyer, but this is propaganda too. I mean, it's totally pointless. I don't think that the problem of Britain is to pay. It's total nonsense. As I said, I think that economically speaking, narrowly economically speaking, it's clear to me that the best option is to stay, even accounting for costs, memberships, fees, whatever. It's a very bad argument, anyway.
Well, it's true we pay into a shared budget at European level, which pays money out also into Britain for the common policies that we have. Sometimes in doing so we are spending money at European level to save money at national level. The very significant research programs, for instance, medical research and other types of research, we've pooled our resources to get a bigger bang for our buck. Now, we spend taxpayers' money at local level, national level, European level. What percentage do you think of our taxpayers' money is spent at European level? Give me a ballpark figure, somebody. 5%, 10%, 20%? Pardon? 1%? It's 1% of GDP. It's 2% of public spending. So 98% of public spending is at national or subnational level. So the EU budget really is not the big factor. It's minor compared to the economic effects of being in the European Union. And as somebody mentioned earlier, the calculation is that for every pound that we pay in the European budget, which is small, the economic benefits of that are probably 10 times bigger. So we get a return of 1 to 10. But it's not through the budget, it's through the much wider economic effects.
I think we'll move to the next motion. Unless you have anything burning desire to say. Motion to defeat the common market, nay, the single market, benefits businesses and consumers by harmonising regulations. I'm going to go with Jeremy on that first, because of his work on that.
The nay. Very, very rhetorical. The common market, nay, the single market, benefits businesses and consumers by harmonising regulations. Okay, so the key thing there, the element from my point of view as an academic in international business is that you need a level playing field in order to be able to have competition. Competition is pro-internal market. Pro-internal market means to say that you observe better the laws of comparative cost advantage, which means to say that there are gains from trade, and that is in fact the huge benefit of being part of the European Union that is the economic justification for me. Cast your mind back to the Roman Empire. What was the growth in the Roman Empire? It was based on trade. Most of the big steps forwards that we've had have been based on trade. And trade is now today augmented by foreign investment. That's multinational firms. That doesn't necessarily mean large multinational firms, I should say. It could mean firms that simply operate in more than one country. Being able to utilize and work assets more effectively using technology, and that technological growth means to say that the European Union has far more potential if we have these harmonized regulations, which is the way that you put it, but I think that's what you are referring to, is this competitive level playing field which will allow firms to be to compete in, as I often say in my lectures, the four corners of the European Union. So every part of the European Union is subject to more intense competition. Without that internal market, you will have segmented national markets. Segmented national markets are even more prone to dominance by a few firms, a few powerful firms, by vested interests. And that is a huge risk for us. So, that's my view. Nay.
Anybody's happy to go?
If you're not fed up with hearing me. the common rules for the common market are crucial. It's what some people refer to as red tape. But they're crucial for two reasons. One, to make the common market fair. That's what, to have common rules on consumer protection, environmental standards, workplace rights, competition policy. But secondly, because when we get it right, that actually cuts red tape for small businesses and big businesses alike. That's because you have a single set of rules instead of 28 different divergent and contradictory sets of rules. It makes it easier. You don't have to adapt your production line to 20, or your labelling or whatever it is, to 28 different sets of rules. That's why one of the reasons why most businesses in Britain, be it the CBI or 60% of the members of the British Chamber of Commerce, which tend to be smaller businesses, support British membership. So it's a win-win. It's a win for protecting consumers, workers and the environment, but it's a win for businesses as well. And it's no surprise, in my view, that the strongest opponents of our membership of the European Union are to be found on the ideological neoliberal right wing of the Conservative Party and UKIP. They hate the fact that the common market has rules. They want a free-for-all, where the multinational companies can do what they like. And they detest the fact that it's got rules to make it fair. So that's my take on that.
Marco?
I basically agree both with the statement and with the other speakers. In addition, I don't think that the main problem for the European countries, including Britain currently, is the rules and the regulations. Regulations are necessary, and it's a good thing to have common regulations. I think that when looking at large economies, and Britain is a large economies are always internal demand driven. So the main issues, the main macroeconomic issues for our countries currently come from the fiscal policy and the monetary policy stance, particularly the fiscal policy stance. We need different macroeconomic policies in Britain and especially in the continent. By contrast, this set of common rules and regulations is fine, and in a way is necessary. In a financially and economically sophisticated world, is absolutely essential. But it's not, in my opinion, it's not the main point, though. Okay. We should discuss much more about macroeconomic policies. We need, rather than.
Yeah, I think the harmonised regulations that affect health, safety and well-being have been a real plus for the European Union. I think in many cases multinational companies do what they like in terms of standards across technology. I've been intimately involved in making those standards, and as I said earlier, that standards bodies are loaded with multinational representatives who get their particular technology built into standards, which means that their patents are then worth something. So I think big businesses benefit from harmonised regulations at the expense of small businesses.
Next motion. Far from Brexit, the UK needs to adopt the euro as a simplified transaction. So this is very much like, not Brexit, but we don't need Brexit, we need to completely adopt the euro. So I'll go on Marco on that.
No, don't do that. Don't do that. I mean, currently nobody wants to join the euro anymore. A few years ago, yes, we had a number of countries, politicians who were eager to join the euro area. But I think, especially for Britain, it would be a massive, huge error. This flexibility, both with the monetary policy, with the currency, but also with the fiscal stance, because if you don't join the euro area, you don't have to meet a number of fiscal criteria which are totally pointless, macroeconomically speaking. This flexibility is a very good thing for this country, and in addition, Britain is also characterized by a very large financial sector, so you can have your currency, and the problem is that other countries chose to join the euro area, and this is creating a lot of problems, even for Britain. Because in a way, even the British government is compelled to, in a way, to meet a certain degree of austerity, because if you don't do that and the other countries are in a recessions and they are your main trade partners, the result is that your trade balance can be affected by that, so you have to, in a way, contain your domestic demand. And so the problem is the euro. The euro can't be the solution. The euro is the problem, not the solution. It's one of the problems, not the only problem.
But if I've got euros, I can go anywhere. But if I'm a business,
You can
I've
go.
got euro,
I'm here, and
simply.
I mean, I came here, and I used to use euros, and now I'm very happy to use sterling pounds and to be paid in sterling pounds. I don't want to be paid in euros, otherwise. No, I'm joking. But
You've got Richard here.
Big business still uses the US dollar as its standard global currency. So you're talking US dollars, the euro hasn't got there. I think the euro represents an illustration of one of the problems of the European Union, in that it expanded and it grew for political reasons. And Gordon Brown deserves some credit for not jumping on that political bandwagon. Countries like Greece, Italy, Spain, Ireland, I don't know the ins and outs, but my perception is that they never really economically qualified to join the euro. The euro could be a great currency if the rules of engagement had been deployed under economic terms rather than the political will to get the euro established and gain market share for the euro.
We'll go with the other Richard.
Yeah, you say the euro is a political project. I remember when the run-up to discussions on whether a single market needs a single currency, it was largely businesses who were saying that trading in a single market with a currency that can change, with 28, or whatever it was then, different currencies that can change in value against each other from one day to the next. It's like asking businesses to trade with a kilo in weight that can fluctuate in value from one week to the next, or a metre that can change in length from one week to the next. So it's businesses that were the key in arguing the benefits of having a single currency. But there are also costs, certainly, in having a single currency. But this is not on the table now. This is not in the referendum. We could only join the euro by having a separate referendum on whether we want to join the euro. So it's not an issue at the moment.
So the UK is very much exempt from joining the euro.
The UK has a legal exemption, is not under any obligation to join the euro. It's up to Britain to decide.
Jeremy?
Yes, I think that the last part of that motion, as it simplifies transactions, is the common sense interpretation of why you should have a single currency. That by having a single currency, you remove what is in effect a tax on internal transactions within the European Union. And that's a very attractive proposition. You just remove a tax and you have a single currency, so it's easy, you can use it anywhere. But actually it's very superficial, because the benefits that you actually get for that are outweighed in many cases, as we have seen with the euro area crisis, by the fact that you do not have an adjustment mechanism, the exchange rate, the ability of exchange rates to depreciate and appreciate with respect to each other. We've seen that problem for the countries in the euro, in that they have not been able to match their needs according to what they would otherwise have done with their own currency. In the UK, we're fortunate that we have the pound sterling, and therefore the pound sterling will float up and down according to the needs of the British economy. So definitely I would say any gain from simply having the same currency in terms of reducing the tax on trade and doing business is trivial compared with that macro economic equilibration mechanism of the exchange rate.
can I add just a minor point?
Yeah, sure.
And if you are the Central Bank of England, you can decide to stabilize the exchange rate with the euro, so there's no need to join the European Monetary Union, the euro area, to get rid of those problems. You can just peg your currency, so you have a fixed exchange regime for a while, and if you are hit by a shock or readjust the exchange rate. So I don't see any reason, especially for Britain, to join the EU.
It's not, there are 9 countries in the EU that are not in the euro, by the way. It's not just Britain.
And if there was a fiscal policy, fiscal union, then would it be good to join the EU, the euro?
It all depends what you mean exactly by fiscal union, because we had a definition earlier, but the term is used by different people to mean different things. There is an argument, irrespective of whether you're in the euro or not, to say that some tax rates should be the same in the single market to avoid distortions of competition. There's arguments against that as well. Some people mean that by fiscal union. I'd like to see the union do a little bit more about multinational companies that transfer profits to the country with the lowest tax rate in order to avoid paying taxes. We're debating in the European Parliament at the moment a principle that every multinational company has to declare country-by-country reporting of where it's made its profit, so that the profit can be taxed in the country where the profit was made and not transferred to Luxembourg or whatever, or the Channel Islands. It's a difficult discussion because on tax things you need every European country to agree, but we're moving slowly towards a better system, shall we say, on that.
And only the EU could do that. Only the EU could do that.
I think we need to, I think in just a time, we've got to touch on that, so I think we'll move to the because the EU only serves a capitalist agenda, we should leave. And this is very much the point that a lot of people make is we've got more chance if we're not in the EU, because the EU is kind of a capitalist thing. We've got more chance with Corbyn mania and all that things. So yeah. So on that, I think we'll go with Marco first, because you did mention you did mention
The revolution.
Yeah, basically that's my point. It depends on your view of the society. It's not a narrowly defined economic argument. If you have a different idea, I used to have the same discussion with my Basque Country's friends, and because sometimes they used to ask me, Marco, what do you think about fighting against Madrid for an independent Basque countries, and my answer was, it depends on your project of society. If you want a different kind of society, call it socialist or whatever, I'm with you, because it's my fighting. If you are just fighting because you don't want to pay taxes to the Madrid's government, it's your business. I don't care about that.
And that could not happen with an EU?
Oh, I know, honestly, everything can happen in the EU, but you can't really transform the EU into something else, because the EU is, as we said, a customs union with a common external policy and tariffs, whose nature is to serve, to defend the interests of European corporations, large corporations, banks, and to some extent to balance this vested interest with the interest of workers and other citizens. You may think that this is the only possible option, and maybe it is. I'm not telling you that we can have something else, that we can have a revolution, but clearly, if you have a totally different idea of society, probably leaving the EU and trying to build up that society in Britain could be easy. I'm not telling you that it's likely to happen. I'm very skeptical about that. And that's why I'm undecided about the referendum. Otherwise, I would vote yes or no.
Does the EU serve a capitalist agenda? Does the UK serve a capitalist agenda?
Yes.
Does any country serve a capitalist agenda? It's a battleground, isn't it? Whether the UK is more or less capitalist, more or less social, is a part of politics. That's what we fight elections for. That's why we try and win elections to change things. And it's the same at European level. The rules the common rules for the common market that I mentioned earlier, that the extreme libertarian, ultra-liberal right in economic terms detests so much, those have been adopted as a result of political battles and political choices. And there's a reason to do it at European level, as I said earlier, as a common rule for our common market. Let's take the question of bankers' bonuses. Remember those obscene levels of bankers' bonuses that we saw that went up even during the economic crisis? When it was suggested in Britain we should do something about that, the government said, oh no, if we do that just in Britain, all the banks will move to Frankfurt and Luxembourg or Dublin. So we did it at European level. There is a limit on bankers' bonuses. It's a quite generous limit. The bonus can't be more than your annual salary. Quite a few of us would like to see a bonus the level of our annual salary, but nonetheless, given the astronomical levels they were at, that was a significant step. We could do that by doing it at European level. But it was a political fight. It was essentially a left-right fight. It was Labour MEPs who led the way on this, by the way, advert for the Labour Party. But nonetheless, how capitalist, how social the European Union is depends on politics, depends on the results of elections, depends on the balance of powers in the European Parliament and in national parliaments in each country and who we elect as governments. That's normal. So it's not inherently capitalist or inherently socialist. It's a battleground, just as the national level is.
Jerry?
Yes, we live in a Western world of capitalist economies, and that is the system. It being the system, it behoves government and its institutions to therefore control the excesses of the capitalist system, and there is no doubt that that is the challenge. Now, when you think about the red tape, regulations, etc., that's the downside of perhaps the dysfunctional aspect of regulations. But if we backtrack to what Richard said a few minutes ago about the work that he's doing at the moment in the Parliament about constraining the excesses with respect to taxation by large and powerful corporates, then I think you can see that the European Union is trying to do something. And I would encourage Richard and his colleagues and all of the other European institutions to go further and try to constrain the large, powerful corporates. It is a challenge, and it's something that we haven't anticipated, I think, within the EU, nor have we anticipated it, I don't think, in the UK. How significant a problem, and also how significant a PR disaster it is for our national governments, not least the UK government, which, as you know, has been trying to patch things up and to make it, trying to get some degree of traction over these large, powerful corporations. And I think the only way we can do that is through the European Union, effectively. Only the EU can do that. So we live in a capitalist world, and it's not about leaving, it's about staying in the European Union and encouraging Richard and his colleagues to get more leverage over those large corporate and multinational interests so that we can live in a better world but still benefit from the productivity growth that is the result of capitalism.
Yeah, one of the thoughts I had going through the comments there, large corporates have been financially managing their profits for forever, for 20, 30 years. I mean, I was aware of large companies funding their businesses through Switzerland or wherever. I would comment that national and European governments have taken far too long in trying to sort of close those loopholes. So I think it's a failure of both national and European governments that these corporations can still do it. With regards to the EU only serving capitalist agendas we should leave, I would say broadly the EU is labelling something capitalist or socialist. It's a kind of it's not an absolute, and I would say that the EU is perhaps more social orientated than it is capital orientated. Regardless of the institution, big business will find a way of managing the agenda.
That's what he had to do when he was in big business.
And can I just say, I am also available for photographs, Jeremy, when I'm speaking.
I thought I got you in.
Why are you taking a picture
I
of
thought I
Richard?
got Owen in and you. That's all right, That's it.
Did you get a photograph of the audience?
I did.
Okay.
I thought you said you were going to take photos.
Yeah, I thought we were, but...
That's why I did the photography, because I didn't see a photographer.
I think in the interest of time, we're going to move to Q&A. We'll take one question here.
Thank you for having me here. I just wanted to point out one, there's a TED talk online. I believe, Mr. Corbett, you mentioned Yanis Varoufakis, the former Greek finance minister. There was a very good talk in Geneva in December 2015, and he has very radical points. He talks about capitalism and democracy and how it's diverging. And kind of relating to the last motion as well, I think last time I checked, the UK wasn't a communist society, and it wasn't capitalist. So it's not just the EU, I think it's the world itself. There's relative points there. But I would also argue, going back to one of the points about how the laws and the bureaucrats are just in the EU, even if we left the EU, geography states that European laws would still apply. There's the European Court of Human Rights, I believe that's one of my notes, as it says. There's also the European Court of Justice. Being in Europe would still mean that the laws still apply, even if we're outside the EU. But also my question kind of boils down to, fair enough, we leave the EU, we try to make new trade agreements with other countries. The US has already said it's not wanting to do that in the near future. But also, what's there to stop anyone from saying, right, so Britain left the EU, sure, we can trust them, they won't use us and then just leave us alone. That's not what they do for the EU, is it? So what's there to stop people from saying, oh, they left the EU, they're not going to leave us? What would you say?
Could you start your question? Just...
There's too many points.
Just in one question, what is...
So what's there to, if Britain was to leave the EU, what's there to stop other countries from not trusting Britain and not to form a relationship or trade agreement?
I mean, because we might leave that as well.
Exactly.
Yeah, well, it's a fair point.
Is that
Yeah.
I've got one question that has two parts. Firstly, relating to what you just said about the EU being social, how can you say that the EU is social if the whole argument about staying in is focusing on economic growth? And also, relating to reforming the EU, how can the EU reform itself if its leaders and decision makers come from the same ideational pool that is nothing more than a mask for corporations? If we leave Europe, is there not more chance that one day we can shift away from the current neoliberal capitalist ideology that has shaped our European and domestic political economy?
Two parts. I had an answer for the first part, and then I got lost. So the point I was making about social is I think Europe has done an awful lot in terms of social regulation that wouldn't have happened had it not been for Europe. I also believe that one of the architects of the European project was an Italian communist. I don't know if that's true or not, that's what I read. So I think Europe has quite a social kind of feel to it. The second part of your question, I tend to agree with, and I would use as an illustration, and if you think about it, you ask yourself the question, what does Donald Trump, Bernie Sanders, Jeremy Corbyn and Nigel Farage have in common? Well, it's a vote for dissatisfaction of the current sort of political operators. Regardless of what those guys say or do, different views, but people are voting for these sort of non-political kind of figures in significant ways. So I agree with you.
Can I just see what Richard Corbett?
Well, the Italian communist you were referring to was Altiero Spinelli, but he left the Italian Communist Party at the time in protest at Stalin's purges in the 1930s. So by then by the time he was involved in making the case for a European Union, it was well after he was no longer a member of any communist party. But the European Union isn't just, as you put it, one side of the political spectrum. If you look at the European Parliament, there's a makeup of by political group. There are socialists, there are communists, there are Greens, not just liberals, conservatives. It's quite pluralistic, and the outcome of the battles on each and every piece of legislation are not predetermined. It's not just dominated by the interests of multinational companies and neoliberals. Far from it. Okay, quite often the outcome is a compromise, but quite a lot of the time it's a compromise that is shifting things, from my point of view, in a better direction, a more socially just single market. Not always. We lose some battles, but often we win them. Yes, for instance, although that was not strictly speaking the European Union, that was the IMF and fellow Eurozone countries that negotiated with Greece, not the European Union as such.
Can I ask, as well as what it stands for, and what are the pros and cons, what on earth is TTIP?
Good question. TTIP is a proposed trade deal between Europe and America. And to go in the ins and outs of it would take a time that we don't now have. But suffice to say that there are some aspects of what's on the table, and we're far from this negotiation being concluded, but some aspects are highly problematic. Such as it would take time. But let me just give one example. Do we want to open the health service to competition from privatised American health companies? Or another example, the proposed investor-state dispute mechanism, which would allow private companies to sue governments for loss of profit in the event of changes of policy affecting their profits. It needs a whole debate in itself, but suffice to say this. Thank goodness this is being negotiated at European level. If we were out of the EU, this government would sign us up to a bilateral trade deal with the US with all the worst features of what is mooted by some people for TTIP. At European level, there are quite a lot of people who share the criticisms that many of us have of these aspects of the proposed deal, and I'm quite confident we will win this battle at European level and make sure that any deal with the United States does not have those negative elements.
There is an interesting video on YouTube by Joseph Stiglitz, the Nobel Prize winner, who is very angry with TTIP. You can take a look on YouTube.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Christine Harlan, School of Politics and International Studies. One of the things that I was surprised that you hadn't discussed was the impact of Brexit on migration and the economic aspects, because that seems to me to be really central.
Yeah, we haven't discussed it, but I just put the slides up because it's a nice picture of Nigel. Sorry, ask a question. This was just to illustrate. We're not moving to that.
You're not going to move that. Because so often when Brexit is discussed, I hear concerns about the possibility that of increased immigration from Europe, and also an idea that if the lower skilled workers went back, if they weren't in Britain, then wages would go up. So what would be the impact really on, or the expected impact on things like wages? Because I think that's a lot of what people are really concerned about, wages and migration.
Me again?
No,
okay.
Yep.
I can tell something about that. I have a clear conflict of interest addressing these questions because I'm an immigrant. I think, macroeconomically speaking, the impact of this flow of immigrants on the, say, British economy is positive, no doubt about that. The overall impact is positive. Even because the vast majority of immigrants, of people coming to the UK, are well-educated people. The degree of education is usually very high relative to the average. So, in the long run, for the economy as a whole, it's good news. However, I'm well aware that for some sectors of our society, for the working class, for people who don't have a high degree of education, particularly the, say, short-run impact of immigration could be negative, could affect the level of wages, but this is a political point. I mean, the British authorities should react by building more schools, services, providing more. In principle, you can do it. You can do it, and there's no reason why immigration should necessarily be a social problem. In practice, it is, especially in some economic sectors when you have unskilled workers and when the pressure of, say, foreign workers can reduce the real wage, or at least the growth rate of real wages of workers. So macroeconomically, no doubt, macroeconomically, the impact is positive. And that's the reason why in 2030, 2040, Great Britain will be the only European countries in the top 10 because of this flow of immigration. Even because the population, I mean, the native population gets older and older, so you need them. But in the short run, you have to do something. Otherwise, you create a struggle within, say, the working class between British workers or unemployed and the immigrants.
So I'm not taking somebody's job right now. Being fictional.
That's all true, but there's a large number of people in Britain who intensely dislike immigration.
Yeah, of course.
Anyone, if you've been out campaigning, knocking on doors, you will have encountered that. To which it's worth pointing out a few facts. First, by the way, most migrants to Britain are from outside the EU, which is entirely up to our rules. Within the EU, we do have a reciprocal right of free movement, and there are almost as many Brits in other EU countries as there are others here. So in terms of the numbers, it's not the EU right that has caused the growth in numbers. And those here pay 1/3 more in tax than they take out in benefits. So indeed, the Treasury should use some of the surplus to provide the necessary services in those areas that are affected by unduly high levels of migration. But that's our own internal problem. It's not something you should blame on the EU.
I think in the interest of time, we'll move to the final statement. We don't have time for another question, I'm really sorry. We'll move on to the final statements, and we've literally got 1 minute. Now, before that, Richard's got to be somewhere else in a minute.
Yeah, sorry, I have a radio interview to do, so
Yeah.
Sorry to go first, but 1 minute, okay. We've talked a lot about economics. Yeah, I just remind people that the EU is not just about economics. It's about scientific research, the way we pool our scientific research, benefit for universities. Universities UK, the Association of British Universities, is saying it would be a disaster for British universities if we left. It's about security. The cooperation we have on fighting transnational criminal gangs through Europol, the European police, and the intelligence networks on dealing with potential terrorist threats. It's about culture and the Erasmus student exchange programme, for instance. It's about the environment, working together on environmental questions which know no borders, and climate change. It's much more than just economics. So although this debate is focused on economics, and the consequences of leaving would be dramatic, it's not the only aspect. And final thing before I go, if you're really interested in this campaign, I've done an app which you can download to your iPhone. You can Google it very easy. It's called Doorstep EU, yeah? And it's got all the arguments and rebuttals and myth-busting and all that. And it's really good value for money because it's free. Thank you very much. And my apologies to rush off filer à l'anglaise, as the French say.
Final statements.
Back to you, Brian. As I mentioned, I'm very undecided, and so I can't really tell you what you have to do. My only thought is, whatever you decide to do, don't stop fighting to change this country. And maybe also to change the European Union. I think it's hard. It's a hard task. But it's worth doing. That's it.
As we've heard from our discussion, the UK in the European Union is in a better shape in order to take advantage of the opportunities in the world economy and also to tackle those very major challenges that exist with respect to the pressure upon our standards with large corporates and multinational firms. And I think that that dimension is being underrepresented in the discussion. I think within the European Union we have much more traction upon these big issues which are becoming bigger all the time.
Yes, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak today. I think I would agree with Jeremy that the UK would be better off inside the EU if the politicians in the UK and the EU were doing a better job than they're doing at the moment. And I think that there is a high level of dissatisfaction from the general public. We are entering into or already in some kind of recession that we will be in for a long time. And unless the politicians do something to improve the situation, you know, get used to Donald Trump, Nigel Farage and Bernie Sanders. Well, actually, I like Bernie. So get used to Donald Trump and Nigel Farage because they will be, you know, in our headlights.